For more than 6 decades, Bob Dylan trained the world not to ask questions. Whenever meaning was demanded, he deflected. Whenever truth was expected, he hid behind riddles. But time has a way of narrowing the distance between myth and confession. Now, in his 80s, Dylan has begun to speak. Not loudly, not directly, but clearly enough to change how his entire life is understood. What he has finally allowed to surface doesn't rewrite his story. It explains it. The boy who learned to disappear. Before he was Bob Dylan, he was Robert Allen Zimmerman, born on May 24th in a quiet corner of Minnesota, far removed from any idea of cultural revolution. His parents, Abram and Beatrice Zimmerman, were part of a small Jewish community shaped by immigrant history, survival, and restraint. When Dylan was still a child, his father contracted polio, a moment that quietly altered the family's future. They relocated to Hibbing, a cold, isolated mining town where silence carried more weight than conversation. The winters were long, the landscape unforgiving, and the sense of distance, from cities, from ambition, from escape, settled deeply into the boy. Dylan grew up with asthma, often physically limited, inward-looking, and prone to long stretches of solitude. While other children played outside, he listened. The sound of foghorns drifting in from nearby Duluth, the hum of radios, the echo of voices that felt larger than his surroundings, these became part of his internal world. His family's roots traced back to Ukraine and Lithuania, histories marked by displacement and loss, and that inherited awareness of fragility would later surface in his writing, long before he had words for it. Music arrived not as a hobby, but as a shock. Around the age of 10, Dylan heard Elvis Presley and Hank Williams on the radio, and something in him reacted viscerally. He later described Hank Williams's voice as an electric jolt, not beautiful in a traditional sense, but honest, wounded, and unguarded. That feeling compelled him toward the piano in his family's home, where he began playing by ear, ignoring formal technique entirely. He didn't read music, he absorbed it. His chords were unconventional, sometimes technically wrong, but emotionally precise. People noticed. By his early teens, Dylan shifted from piano to guitar and began forming bands, drawn especially to the raw energy of Little Richard. It wasn't just the sound that fascinated him, it was the persona, the clothes, the confidence, the sense that identity itself could be performed. Dylan wanted that transformation. In high school, he formed a band called the Golden Chords and played loud, fast rock music that often unsettled authority figures. One school performance became legend after the microphone was reportedly cut off due to volume. Whether the incident happened exactly as remembered mattered less than what it symbolized. Dylan already understood the power of disruption. Even then, he began inventing himself. He told classmates he was an orphan. He claimed origins that were untrue, biographies that shifted depending on the listener. These weren't random lies. They were rehearsals. Dylan was learning that identity could be shaped, discarded, rebuilt. When he later said he didn't know what his songs meant and asked listeners what they thought instead, it wasn't evasiveness. It was philosophy. Meaning, like identity, was not fixed. In 1959, Dylan moved to Minneapolis and briefly enrolled at the University of Minnesota, but academic life held no interest for him. He gravitated instead toward Dinkytown, a neighborhood of coffee houses, political talk, poetry, and folk music. He lived above a drugstore, played small venues for minimal pay, and sometimes got fired for asking for more money. It was here that he first introduced himself as Bob Dylan. The name appeared suddenly, without explanation. Some speculated it came from the poet Dylan Thomas. Others suspected it was borrowed from television or folklore. Dylan never confirmed any version. The ambiguity was intentional. Around this time, someone handed him a copy of Woody Guthrie's autobiography, Bound for Glory. The effect was immediate and irreversible. Dylan abandoned electric guitar for acoustic, shifted away from rock bravado, and began writing songs rooted in social observation and moral urgency. Guthrie wasn't just a musical influence. He was a template for how a life could be lived through song. By the end of that year, Dylan dropped out of college entirely. Minnesota was no longer enough. In January, a 19-year-old Dylan boarded a bus and headed east, traveling through brutal winter weather with little more than a guitar and a vague plan. His destination was New York City. His purpose was singular. He wanted to meet Woody Guthrie, who was then hospitalized in New Jersey, slowly deteriorating from Huntington's disease. Dylan found him there, played for him, and received a note in return that read, "I ain't dead yet." That moment anchored him. Soon after, he wrote Song to Woody, one of only 2 original compositions on his debut album. That album, recorded quickly and cheaply, barely sold at first. Executives doubted him. Some openly mocked his voice. But one man didn't. Producer John Hammond saw something others missed and signed Dylan to Columbia Records without hesitation. The sessions were difficult. Dylan hated repetition, wandered away from the microphone, and refused polish. The record failed commercially, but Dylan had already moved forward. The woman who changed his voice. When Bob Dylan met her in the early 60s, he was still forming himself, not just as an artist but as a man. Fame had not yet hardened him, and ambition had not fully replaced vulnerability. She was intelligent, politically engaged, and deeply aware of the world beyond music. Her upbringing had been shaped by activism and ideas, and she carried herself with a seriousness that immediately drew him in. Dylan later described the encounter as instant and overwhelming, a connection that shifted his center of gravity almost overnight. They moved in together quickly, and her influence was unmistakable. She introduced him to poetry, foreign cinema, political theory, and a broader moral vocabulary. Before her, Dylan wrote songs that mimicked forms he admired. With her, he began writing songs that confronted injustice, power, and responsibility. This was not coincidence. During their time together, his songwriting sharpened, growing more precise, more accusatory, and more emotionally anchored. The shift was visible to anyone paying attention. Some of his most important early works emerged from this period, shaped by the world she opened to him. These songs were not slogans. They were narratives filled with empathy and restraint. They didn't demand agreement. They demanded reflection. Even Dylan's public image changed. The famous album cover showing them walking arm in arm through a New York street captured something real: intimacy, warmth, and a fragile sense of balance. But as Dylan's fame accelerated, pressure seeped into every corner of their relationship. He was being pulled into interviews, performances, expectations, and myth-making. She struggled with the scrutiny, the loss of privacy, and the emotional distance that came with his growing stature. Her family distrusted him, sensing instability beneath the talent. The more he rose, the more confined she felt. The night he turned his back. By the mid-60s, Bob Dylan was no longer just a promising songwriter. He had become a symbol, and symbols are rarely allowed to remain human for long. Audiences wanted him to speak for them, to explain the world, to confirm their beliefs. Dylan felt the weight of those expectations tightening with every performance. He had already lost the woman who once anchored him, and now he felt trapped by the role others had assigned him. The music that once felt urgent began to feel restrictive. The turning point arrived when Dylan chose to abandon the sound that had made him a movement. When he began playing electric music, it wasn't a whim or a betrayal for shock value. It was an act of self-preservation. He wanted complexity instead of certainty, ambiguity instead of instruction. The songs became less direct, more fractured, mirroring his own internal confusion. This shift culminated on stage in front of an audience that expected reassurance and instead received defiance. The backlash was immediate and deeply personal. Night after night, crowds who once cheered him reacted with anger. They booed, shouted insults, and accused him of selling out. One moment during a performance in England became infamous when a voice from the audience labeled him a traitor. Dylan's response was cold and unflinching. He denied the accusation and ordered his band to play louder. It was not bravado, it was exhaustion. Behind the scenes, the pressure was relentless. The tours were physically and emotionally draining, fueled by little sleep and constant tension. Dylan's health suffered, and his behavior grew erratic. Friends later described him as unraveling, pushed beyond endurance. Then, abruptly, everything stopped. A motorcycle crash near Woodstock forced him out of public view. Details were scarce, and Dylan offered no clarification. For many, the accident marked a sudden break. In truth, it became an escape. Removed from the spotlight, Dylan withdrew into domestic life, silence, and obscurity. The prophet disappeared. What remained was a man trying to survive the consequences of becoming too important, too quickly. The marriage, the mask, and the wound. When Bob Dylan retreated from public life, he did not disappear into chaos. He disappeared into structure. Away from stages and confrontations, he married quietly and built a domestic world that stood in sharp contrast to the myth that surrounded him. The marriage was kept deliberately private, shielded from the press and even from many friends. For a time, it worked. Dylan became a father, adopted routines, and embraced a slower rhythm that grounded him in ways fame never had. Those close to him during this period described a man who seemed calmer, more present, almost ordinary. Creatively, this retreat reshaped his work. The music softened. The urgency of protest gave way to introspection and restraint. He recorded with a looseness that felt less like performance and more like observation. Yet beneath that calm, something unresolved lingered. Domestic stability did not erase the emotional fracture left by earlier loss. It merely concealed it. As the years passed, the marriage began to strain under pressures both internal and external. Dylan was restless by nature, resistant to explanation, and emotionally guarded. His need for privacy clashed with the demands of intimacy. Misunderstandings multiplied. Trust eroded. Eventually, the personal conflict bled into his art. That rupture surfaced most clearly in an album that felt less like a release and more like a confession. Though Dylan denied it was autobiographical, those closest to him recognized the truth immediately. The songs were raw, restrained, and devastatingly specific in emotion. They spoke of distance, regret, resentment, and longing without naming names. His son would later confirm what listeners had long suspected. The music reflected the collapse of his parents' relationship, faith, secrecy, and the second disappearance. By the late 70s, Bob Dylan was once again unrecognizable to those who thought they knew him. Just as the world was still processing the emotional wreckage of his divorce, he made another abrupt turn, this time inward, toward faith. During a concert tour, a small silver cross was thrown onto the stage. Dylan picked it up without comment. Days later, alone in a hotel room, he claimed to have experienced a physical encounter with Jesus. He described shaking uncontrollably, overcome by a sensation he could neither explain nor dismiss. For Dylan, this was not symbolism. It was conviction. What followed stunned both fans and critics. Dylan declared himself a born-again Christian, immersed himself in Bible study, and began recording gospel albums that left no room for ambiguity. He stopped performing many of his older songs and instead preached from the stage between performances, warning audiences about judgment, war, and salvation. Concertgoers walked out. Tickets were resold for a fraction of their price. Longtime supporters felt abandoned. Dylan did not retreat. He doubled down. Yet even as he spoke publicly about faith, his personal life moved deeper into secrecy. In the mid-'80s, Dylan entered a relationship with one of his backup singers. They married quietly, using legal measures to seal records. When their daughter was born, his name did not appear on the birth certificate. For more than a decade, the marriage and the child remained unknown to the public. Even close associates were unaware. Dylan insisted on silence, not out of shame, but protection. He later allowed it to be known that privacy was the only way he believed a normal childhood was possible. Musically, this period marked his lowest point. Albums released during these years were rushed, inconsistent, and poorly received. Critics called them unfocused. Dylan himself later admitted he was lost. The faith that once gave him clarity no longer anchored him. The secrecy that once felt necessary became isolating. By the end of the decade, his career appeared to be fading, the late truth and the shape of the answer. When Bob Dylan re-emerged creatively in the late 90s, it wasn't with rebellion or reinvention, but with reckoning. The voice was older, rougher, and stripped of illusion. The songs carried fatigue, mortality, and memory rather than defiance. This period marked a quiet return to honesty, not in interviews but in tone. Dylan no longer needed to shock anyone. He needed to endure. As the decades passed, he became more selective with words spoken off stage, yet more revealing in unexpected moments. At an age when most artists retreat entirely, Dylan began allowing fragments of truth to surface. He did not offer a formal confession. He never named names publicly, but patterns emerged. He acknowledged regret. He spoke of love that never left him. He hinted that one loss, early and unresolved, had shaped everything that followed. Friends noticed it. So did listeners willing to read between the lines. The myths that once surrounded him slowly loosened. The motorcycle crash no longer looked like an accident alone, but an exit. The religious phase no longer seemed like confusion, but refuge. The disappearances were no longer evasions, but survival strategies. And the woman he met in his early 20s, the one whose influence reshaped his voice, his politics, and his emotional compass, emerged as the missing key. He had protected that truth for decades, not out of mystery, but out of pain. In his 80s, Dylan finally responded directly to public rumor for the first time, dismissing false narratives while quietly reinforcing something else, that he had never been what people projected onto him. He was never a prophet, never a spokesman, never a riddle meant to be solved. He was a man who learned early that telling the whole truth costs too much, and that sometimes silence is the only way to keep what mattered alive. The confession was never a sentence. It was a lifetime of choices finally aligning. So after everything, the fame, the disappearances, the faith, and the silence, do you believe Bob Dylan spent his life running from the truth or protecting it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories behind the legends you thought you knew.